My name is Hugh Maynard.
Dipti Gupta.
My name is Zoonie Nguyen.
Dimitri Nasrallah.
Lynn Sock.
Marianne Ackerman.
My name is Rodgers Sinha.
Paulina, Abarca-Cantin.
My full name, Elkin, Orlai, Polo, Yera.
My name is Louis Rodgers.
Hello, this is the third episode of ELAN's Waves of Change project about identity and belonging in the English-speaking communities of Quebec. The people you are going to meet here and their families arrived in Quebec during the turbulent years of the FLQ crisis and two bitterly contested sovereignty referendums. They'll be talking about why they chose to emigrate here during a time of turmoil, why they stayed during the decades of linguistic tensions when so many others left, and how they feel about being English speakers living in Quebec today. Let's hear what they have to say.
In 1970, the world's first democratically elected Marxist government came into power, the government of Salvador Allende in Chile. In 1973, a violent coup d'etat overthrew that government. I was 8 years old. When the coup d'etat ensued, persecutions, deaths, tortures, disappearances happened immediately. My father was a doctor. My mother was a doctor. One of the most violent persecutions were undertaken against doctors. We came to Canada. We were able to exit Chile through various ways and very difficult means.
When we left Vietnam, we left on the very last day, April 30th, 1975. And my parents, with the 8 kids, they wanted to have a better future for us because they didn't know how it would be with the communists taking over from in the South. And so we took off on the very last boat. We were 3 days, 2 nights on a boat that had a capacity of 500 people, and we were 4,000 Vietnamese trying to escape. And on the 3rd day, the boat was sinking. We thought we would all die, but we got rescued by a big Danish cargo that took us to Hong Kong. You know, I was 8 years old. So obviously, for me, it's like, wow, it's like a new adventure. I've never seen so many white people in my life. But as a child, I thought it was hard because we went to those classes d'accueil to make sure that we understood French. And from there, it didn't take long. We started regular school, but I remember being bullied because I didn't know how to speak Québécois. The only French I knew was from the Tintin, right? Saperlipopette, zut alors. And you don't speak like that in the schoolyard because you get beat up really fast. And that's what happened to me. So it was tough to try to speak like them.
Well, I was born in 1977, which was 2 years into the Lebanese Civil War, and by 1982, the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Israeli military were having a war in our neighborhood. So the neighborhood was destroyed and we had nowhere else to go, so we got on a boat and we left. We arrived under the auspices that my parents' French proficiency would work out well for them here. My mother was a French teacher, but as an immigrant, no one would give her a job as a French teacher. There were 4 of us living in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment, all on top of each other. I was held back a year in school and put in a classe d'accueil. I felt alienated from everyone around me because my French was really non-existent at that point.
My parents, my brother, my grandmother escaped Cambodia due to the Khmer Rouge regime. My mother was pregnant with me. We stopped off in Thailand. My mother gave birth to me. And then we landed on Canadian soil in 1980. We first moved to Ottawa, and then we moved to Montreal in 1986.
I actually had a wonderful support network with my in-laws and my husband. But one of my first memories is to be introduced to the French classes in Quebec. And I took them, and very soon after, Radio Canada was doing a show on immigrants, and they picked me for some reason. And they flew me to James Bay, and at that time, my political leanings were such that I asked them, "Is like, what is the percentage of indigenous people on this project?" And they realized that they had picked up the wrong immigrant. So I was no longer the perfect immigrant, and they realized that they had actually taken somebody who was extremely political.
In Toronto, I was also, even as a student, I was working professionally with a choreographer named Luc Tremblay. And he got a position as artistic director of Danse Partout in Quebec City. So he brought me, as well as several other very advanced students, also like myself, eager to get out there and work, to Quebec City. And I arrived there in 1986. Je parlais pas un mot en français.
My dad arrived not speaking a word of French, but he felt it was important to learn French as soon as possible. So he bought himself a little book on how to learn French. And within 2 weeks of arriving in Montreal, he was reading this book downtown without shoes, maybe something to do with growing up in Australia. But he was reading his book, and this cute girl walked by and asked him, "T'as pas froid aux pieds?" And obviously he didn't understand what that meant, so he kind of indicated he didn't understand. She said, "Aren't you cold with your feet?" And he's like, "Yes, maybe we could grab a coffee or something." And that turned out to be my mom. So the support mechanism was definitely her, and her including him into her family, helping him navigate the French side of Quebec. And that definitely helped him out make it in Quebec.
I think my mother didn't receive that much of support. I think, first of all, not speaking English or French, only Spanish, she understood that she needed at least some other people, Colombian people that could at least assist her. That was the only way for her to get a job, to get the apartment, and for her to work actually in Chabanel, where's the big industries of fabric. She was working as sewing with a sewing machine. That was pretty much hard because actually in the first few months, the apartment where we were staying, we got robbed. So we had to move from Champagneur to Delépée. And that's where I started to go to Classe d'accueil, where it was very rough, actually not speaking the language.
So how strongly does Montreal feel like home to you?
Oh, I was totally aware of the politics. That was one of the reasons to come here, because something was happening, whereas I figured nothing was happening anywhere else in Canada. I was a journalist at the beginning. I was covering Quebec culture. I was theatre critic at the Gazette. I was very much going to Quebec plays and experiencing that.
Lived on the West Island, and it was a world unto itself. And even during the period of the War Measures Act, a bunch of friends from high school, we went down to watch the football finals at the Autostad. And on the way back, we got stopped by the police in Lachine because we got lost, and they wondered why we were wandering around the docks in somebody else's car. Well, they just rolled down the window and realized we were Anglos, and we obviously weren't FLQ terrorists.
The radio was always on at our house. All the adults in my life talked politics all the time, world politics from every country, sharing information, usually by letters or by radio at the time, 1974. Perhaps what's notable or interesting is my brother and I began English school with a number of my other friends because that was possible then. And I remember at some point hearing my peers speak very derogatively of the Quebecois, peppers, Frenchies. And it was then that I realized that there was a different politic between these two cultures. We like to go out to Kanawake sometimes, and I saw that there was another culture there as well.
My husband had written a play called Land Where the Trees Talk on the Oka situation, and he was writing the play when we were getting to know each other. And so when I came here, the play had already happened, had performed in Centaur, and right after he started writing on the referendum issue, and that was the first play that I acted in. So it was like literally getting into the situation and feeling and sensing it.
When we moved to Montreal, I was able to go to English school. I grew up in Lachine, and all I knew about Lachine was that Lachine is divided up into avenues. So in the higher avenues, from 32nd to 55th Avenue, it's very English, white Anglo-Saxon. That's where I went to school. We knew that we didn't dare cross past the lower avenues because that's where the real French, Quebecois separatists lived, and they wouldn't welcome us. But my childhood was great. When I got to grade 10, in grade 10, that's when you study the history of Quebec as part of the curriculum in order to graduate. When I was in grade 10, that was also the year of the 1995 referendum. And that was a big shocker to me. That year was the first year where I knew that there were political issues here in Quebec. Prior to that, I was just being a kid.
Well, I was only a kid in 1995, but I was definitely aware that there was something big going on. I remember the graffiti on the wall, "We know." And I remember my best friend in primary school walked up to me one day before the referendum, and he was Francophone. He asked me, "Are your parents going to vote yes or no?" And I said no. And he said, "Oh, well, my parents are going to vote yes, and so we can't be friends anymore. We can't talk anymore."
I understand what it's like to lose a language. I lost two. I did understand the need to retain the culture because having lost mine, I felt that I was at a disadvantage. So that was my shift and my adjustment towards the appreciation of Quebec culture and the language and the culture. 1995, I was working with Sylvain Mardance, and we had a tour to Edmonton at the time of the referendum. So there we are in an airport, I think it was Calgary, and this young girl comes up to us, and really, she said, while a group of us, we were talking, and she obviously heard that a number of people there were Quebecois. She asked, "Why do you hate us so much?"
When the referendum happened and everything went ahead, and with Parizeau saying the immigrants and the ethnic, the immigrant and the money and the ethnic vote is what made them lose, I felt like I was responsible, to the effect that later on, when I was trying to find work and try to even get back to some kind of form of work in cinema, I got something at the National Film Board, and one young man said to me, "It's people like you who will take away our jobs." And I felt really threatened. And that transpired me to getting into university and getting into an education so that I can be at the same level, even though I had a 5-year-long work experience and everything else. It just put me in a very awkward space and made me conscious of this immigrant notion. And while I actually was quite aware that I was an immigrant settler in this province also.
How strongly do you feel you belong in Quebec?
So I have 4 children, and I remember this was a big debate when my oldest was ready to enter school because on their grandparents' side, from their father's side, they had placed my now ex-husband in French elementary school when he was growing up, and they insisted that their grandchildren also go to French elementary school. And I was adamant. I said, no, my children are going to go in the English sector. So my kids have been raised in the English sector. They've always been to a French immersion school. I said I was raised very English. By the time I graduated high school, I didn't know much French other than singing Alouette, and that was about it. But I learned all of my French from working, and I told my children the same thing.
And in 2000, my current partner, who is Quebecois, proposed to me with the caveat that he would never speak English. And I said, why? And he said, because I'm incapable of learning. I said, why? He said, I've tried and I can't do it. I said, okay, you hold that thought. And we proceeded to marry and reproduce with our first son, Sebastian, now 18. Our second son, Nicholas, is now 15. When both came into the world, there was Danielle's Quebecois family, who speaks French mostly only, my widowed mother and my brother, who speak Spanish and, of course, other languages, but we maintain our Spanish.
I have 2 kids. So I have my son who's 22 and my daughter is 18. It's important for me that they speak as many languages as possible. But I gave up on Vietnamese. So they're bilingual. So I'm very proud of that. When I'm very emotional, I say it in French, even if I raise my kids more in English. But yeah, I would like them to speak both languages like me and to be able to feel it and think it and express it.
I'm really happy that my daughter, who's 23 now, went through elementary and high school in French. I just loved it. I had my personal translator whenever I had any hiccups. And she learned Hindi at home, and we speak Hindi, and it's really fun. And whenever I hear her speak with her friends, it's with such a strong Quebecois accent, and I love it. I mean, it's such a fantastic, group of friends that we often have in the house also. When she was younger, I was very conscious about trying to, in fact, volunteer at her school and so on. So, and a lot of parents were thankfully, very helpful and, showed me whenever I actually stumbled over a word and so on. They were very supportive of that. And that's one of been my really amazing experiences in this.
My daughter was 3 when we came to Montreal, and I put her in a Maison de l'Amitié. It was a multilingual but mainly francophone daycare, and I didn't even really say much. I just put her in, and after about 4 months, I said, "So how's it going with the French?" And she said, "It's going okay. I can speak it, I can sing it, but I have trouble understanding it." So she just went into French and then went to FACE in the French side and completely identified with herself, identified as a francophone. And so fast forward a few years later, I moved to France. I was living there for about 7 years, and she came over to visit one summer, and we're sitting in a restaurant in Toulouse, and the waiter comes over, very loquacious, and said something to her, and she answered him in this Quebecois French. I had never heard her speak French, really. And he's like, "Oh, la petite Québécoise, c'est mignon." And I'm like, wow, this is amazing.
It was a struggle for me because I was not the greatest parent in terms of speaking English to my kids. That was our rule. I would speak English, Mireille would speak French, but it was a struggle for me because I wanted to have a conversation with my kids, and it was hard for me because they didn't understand really what I was saying when I was trying to speak to them in English. C'était dur. It was not easy. But then at an age for both my kids, around 9 or 10, it just kicked in. They became completely bilingual with even no accent, I would say not even an effort of my part.
My wife is from the East End of Montreal, so she grew up as an Anglophone, but it was quite bilingual. When we had children, we were determined that they were going to be fluently bilingual because the ironic thing about being an English speaker in Quebec is you have to speak French, and you have to do it well because otherwise you can't get a job and you can't function in society. So I think we've done pretty well because both my kids, son and a daughter, have stayed here in Quebec and are having their own children now, and they're pretty bilingual. You can never really say that you're fluently bilingual. My son-in-law is what I call a Franglo. His mother was English, his father was French, and he's just unbelievable. You can't tell when he speaks English or French of which linguistic group he's from. So that's always the aim.
I feel very lucky to have had one parent speaking to me only in English when I was growing up, another parent speaking to me in French. I did all my schooling in French, so it permitted me to feel completely comfortable in Quebec, but have the luxury to switch to English if need be. And now that I'm a dad, my wife is American, so we're recreating the same thing. She only speaks to our daughter in English. I speak to her in French, and her schooling will be in French. And hopefully she'll feel as comfortable in Quebec and Canada as me and my sister got to be.
And how strongly do you feel you belong in Canada?
would have to say that the most striking experience I had was when Claire Shapiro and I founded Theatre 1774, and we made a list of directors we wanted to work with, and we thought we'd work our way through, and at the top was a very young but very exciting Robert Lepage, and he said yes. So we put this play on called Echo, which Robert devised, and it was a big production, took a year and a half to get it on, and the reviews that came out, the way the media treated it, the Francophone media, they all came, and it was reviled for, I remember the Le Devoir headline was, "Que fait Robert Lepage dans ce galère?" Which, why would he work with the English? It was so politicized. And I was shocked because really, I mean, you can like or not like what's going on. But then we did L'Affaire Tartuffe, a bilingual play, and then the reviews were again, oh, they're Federalists. No, they're not Federalists. So we were always reviewed as a political act.
I think that chip on my shoulder that I had from the late 80s ended up finally dissipating around 2016 when my English novels first began getting translated into French. And I hadn't expected for there to be any attention at all, but there was such an explosion of attention and admiration and curiosity around those books, and it became this media bubble for like 2 years, that I realized there are many different types of Francophones in the end. And I had maybe earlier on just been around the wrong people.
Growing up here, like I said, being bullied in a schoolyard because I didn't speak like the other kids, that was really tough. But then the minute I decided that I will belong, I decided that at the age of 9. And so practicing how to say Colin the bin, tabarnouche, in front of the mirror, moving your lips so that you sound and I've succeeded because I became actually pretty popular in high school. I was able to belong. I worked hard at it, though.
The families that arrived during this period, between 1970 and 1995, were not blindsided by the dramatic changes that were transforming Quebec. They had a good idea what they were getting into, and they were prepared to work hard and adapt to make a new life here. They did not experience the same traumas as earlier immigrants. This period is remembered as the Exodus. The net interprovincial loss for Quebec was more than 500,000 people after 1966. As this graph shows, almost 150,000 Quebecers left just during the 5 turbulent years between 1976 and 1981. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was a real concern that people with English names and accents would not be hired. A number of popular books documented these fears. The Anglo Guide to Survival in Quebec became a bestseller. William Weintraub's novel, The Underdogs, portrayed an Anglo underclass in a dystopian, independent Quebec. Bowser and Blue wrote about the situation in comic songs. But the concerns were very real, and so were the departures. How many people is 500,000? Anglos are always associated with Westmount, which has a population of about 20,000. So the number of people who left Quebec during that turbulent period is equal to 25 Westmounts. That is a lot of people. Their departure had a devastating effect on the English-speaking community and a negative impact on Quebec's economy. There is surprisingly little data to put human faces on these departure statistics. We know more about the people who chose to stay in Quebec. There were major demographic transfers from the regions to Montreal. Census numbers show sharp declines in Anglos living in the eastern townships, West Quebec, the Laurentians and Lanaudière, Quebec City, the North Shore, and the Gaspé. We'll find out more about these communities in episode 6. We can also see patterns of movement within Quebec and in Montreal, but it is not easy to distinguish whether the factors that caused families to relocate were mostly economic, social, or political. Montreal East, near the refineries, had a sizable English-speaking community. They are gone, and their schools and churches have been bulldozed. Rosemount had a population of 186,000 in 1966. Almost 30% of them were English-speaking. That was about 50,000 people. Only a few thousand Rosemount residents are still English speakers, but 2 schools and several churches still serve the greatly reduced community. I lived in Rosemount during the 1980s. It was a time when Anglos were reluctant to draw attention to themselves by speaking English in public. I remember taking my small children to see the Saint Jean parade as it traveled east along Sherbrooke toward the Olympic Stadium. Every few minutes, the crowd would start chanting, Le Québec aux Québécois. People in the crowd who were not dyed-in-the-wool francophones wondered if the new Quebec would include them. It has taken decades to understand the forces at work during that period. French Quebec was reacting to legitimate injustices involving language and opportunities. Governments of Quebec and Canada bore part of the blame. Catholic and Protestant religions bore part of the blame. But the most convenient scapegoat was a wealthy, oppressive Anglo elite. There was some truth to those accusations, but painting all Anglos as members of an oppressive 1% was not true and not fair. What about the poor Irish driven into exile by famine? Or the Scots forcibly evicted during the Highland clearances? Or the descendants of slaves who made new lives in Little Burgundy? Or the Jews and Chinese who did not choose to be educated in English? The other important factor to remember is that the Anglos and allophones who chose to stay in Quebec accepted the new social contract. They learned French and mixed with the majority. In the post-religious period, almost a third of Anglos have been in romantic relationships with Francophones. It might have been a survival mechanism, but it has been effective. The children of those mixed marriages are remarkably bilingual and bicultural. Allophones who were placed in classe d'accueil because of Bill 101 can speak French fluently. But the children did not always feel welcome. The accueil sometimes was missing. English-speaking immigrants not born in Canada were obliged to attend French schools. They understood that learning French is a smart thing to do for anyone who plans to stay in Quebec, but they too have sometimes felt like they did not fully belong in Quebec. In the next episode of Waves of Change, we'll meet families that arrived after 1995. Their experience has been dramatically different than families who arrived here earlier. I hope you'll join us for the next episode of Waves of Change.